The autumn of 1878 settled over the borderlands like a vulture waiting for something to die. Down in the Rio Grande Valley, where Texas met Mexico and the law was as scarce as honest men, there lived a cowboy named Caleb "Cal" Brennan who farmed a small patch of stubborn earth with nothing but determination and sweat. His spread sat lonely on the north bank of the river, a modest adobe house with a tin roof and enough acreage to grow corn and beans when the rains came. Cal had come to this desolate stretch of country after the war between the states, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a fierce need to be left alone. The farm wasn't much to look at, a few acres of crops, a vegetable garden, some chickens, and an old mule named Jeremiah who was too ornery to die. But it was his, bought and paid for with his mustering out pay. The cowboy was a lean man in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and hands that showed the calluses of honest labor. He wore the same clothes day after day, faded blue trousers held up by suspenders, a cotton shirt that had seen better years, and a heavy wool coat that had belonged to his father during the war. That coat was Cal's most prized possession, the only thing he owned that connected him to family and better times. It was made of thick brown wool lined with flannel, and cut in the military style with brass buttons that still caught the light despite their tarnish. His father had worn it through 3 years of fighting with the Texas Brigade before a Yankee bullet found him at Gettysburg. Cal had carried the coat through his own service, and now it was all he had left of the man who'd taught him that helping those in need was the highest calling of any decent soul. The borderlands where Cal had made his home were a dangerous place in those days, caught between two countries, and claimed by neither with any real authority. Mexican bandits crossed the river regularly, raiding isolated farms. American outlaws fled south when the law got too close, and Apache bands moved through the area like ghosts. Most sensible folks avoided the region entirely, but Cal had chosen it precisely because of its isolation. On this particular evening in late October, with the first real cold snap of the season settling over the valley, Cal was finishing his daily chores when he heard something that made him pause, the sound of hoofbeats, but not the steady rhythm of a horse being ridden with purpose. These were the irregular steps of an animal near exhaustion, stumbling and uncertain. What he saw emerging from the gathering dusk was a sight that would have been pitiful if it hadn't been so dangerous. A man on horseback was approaching his farm, but both rider and mount looked ready to collapse. The horse was a small Mexican pony, its ribs showing through a coat dulled by poor feed and hard travel. The rider was worse off, a young Mexican man, maybe 20 years old, slumped forward in his saddle with blood seeping through a crude bandage wrapped around his left arm. The young Mexican looked up as he approached the farmhouse, and Cal saw eyes filled with pain and desperation. "Por favor," the stranger whispered, his voice barely carrying across the evening air. "Water. My horse." Before he could say more, he slid from the saddle and collapsed in Cal's dusty yard. Cal stood for a long moment, weighing his options. Every instinct born of war and wilderness told him to drag the stranger back onto his horse and send him on his way. But as he looked down at the unconscious young man, he saw something that cut through his caution. The stranger was wearing the remnants of what had once been a fine uniform, dark blue with silver braiding, but it was torn and blood-stained beyond recognition. More importantly, the young man was shivering in the cold evening air, his lips already taking on a blue tinge that spoke of the chill settling into his bones. Cal had seen enough men die of exposure to recognize the signs, and despite every rational thought in his head, he found himself kneeling beside the fallen rider and checking his pulse. The cowboy looked around his small farm, checking the horizon for any sign that the stranger had been followed, then made a decision that would change everything. He lifted the unconscious man and carried him into the adobe house, laying him on the simple wooden bed. The wounded stranger was burning with fever despite his shivering, and his clothes were soaked with sweat and blood. Cal built up the fire in his small stone fireplace and put water on to boil, then began the careful process of cleaning and bandaging the stranger's wound. The bullet had passed clean through the flesh of his upper arm without hitting bone, which was lucky, but the wound was infected and would need careful tending. As the night deepened and the temperature continued to drop, the stranger's shivering grew worse despite the warmth of the fire. Cal piled his own blankets on the bed, but it wasn't enough. The young man's teeth chattered constantly, and his breathing became labored as his body fought both infection and cold. Standing in his small cabin, watching a stranger fight for his life, Cal faced a choice that would have been simple for the man his father had raised him to be. He looked at his father's coat hanging on its peg by the door, the thick wool garment that had kept him warm through countless cold nights since coming to the borderlands. It was the only heavy clothing he owned, his shield against the harsh winter nights that were coming. The decision, when it came, felt like something outside himself making the choice. Cal took down the coat and spread it over the shivering stranger, tucking it around him like a blanket. The thick wool immediately began to trap the young man's body heat, and his shivering gradually subsided as warmth returned to his limbs. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending cold drafts through every crack in the adobe walls. Cal pulled his chair closer to the fire and wrapped himself in a thin cotton blanket, knowing it would be a long, cold night. Without his father's coat, he would have to tend the fire constantly to keep from freezing. The young man slept through the night, his fever breaking just before dawn. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the American cowboy sitting by the dying fire, shivering in the morning cold. The stranger tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his bandaged arm. "Senor," he said in accented but clear English, "you have saved my life, but you are freezing. Please, take back your coat." He began to push the wool garment away, but Cal held up a hand to stop him. "Keep it," the cowboy said simply. "You need it more than I do right now." He stood and moved to the stove, beginning the process of making coffee. "Name's Cal Brennan. This here's my farm. You're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel, but I got to know. Who's chasing you and how much trouble am I likely to see for helping you?" The young man was quiet for a long moment, studying Cal's weathered face. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Captain Miguel Alejandro Herrera of the Mexican Army," he said quietly. "And, senor, I'm afraid that helping me may have put you in more danger than you can possibly imagine." Cal poured coffee and handed a cup to his guest. "Reckon I've been in danger before. Question is, what kind of danger we talking about and from which direction it's likely to come?" Miguel took a sip of the coffee and winced. 3 days ago, I was stationed at the garrison in Piedras Negra. My unit was responsible for border security. There is a man, a colonel named Esteban Varga, who has been using his position to facilitate the crossing of stolen goods and wanted criminals. When I discovered evidence of his corruption and reported it to my superiors, I learned that his influence reaches far higher than I had imagined. Rather than investigate my claims, they declared me a traitor and ordered my arrest. Cal listened without interruption. "So you lit out for the territory. But why come this way?" Miguel shook his head. "Colonel Varga has men everywhere in Mexico. My only chance was to reach the American authorities and present my evidence to someone who could act on it. I was trying to reach Fort Clark when his men caught up with me yesterday evening." The captain reached into his shirt and withdrew a leather portfolio, wrapped in oiled cloth. "This contains documents that prove Varga's corruption, records of payments, lists of criminals he has helped escape justice. With this evidence, your army could shut down his operation and perhaps prevent a war that he seems determined to provoke." Cal accepted the portfolio but didn't open it. "War?" "Varga has been deliberately creating conflicts. Raids on American ranches by bandits under his protection, attacks on Mexican citizens that he claims were carried out by American soldiers. Each incident pushes our countries closer to open warfare, which would be very profitable for a man who sells weapons to both sides." As if summoned by their conversation about danger, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the morning air. Cal was at the window instantly, peering through a gap in the shutters. "How many men does this Varga have?" Miguel struggled to sit up. "Too many, and they will not hesitate to kill anyone who has helped me." He tried to stand, but his injured arm made him dizzy. "Senor Brennan, you must give me up to them. Tell them you found me here and were about to turn me in." Cal looked at the young captain, still wrapped in his father's coat, and felt something stir in his chest that he thought had died at Gettysburg. "Miguel, you ever been in a real fight?" The captain shook his head. "I am a staff officer, senor. My duties were administrative, not combat." "Well, you're about to get an education." Cal moved to a wooden chest and began pulling out weapons, a shotgun, a rifle, boxes of ammunition, and a second revolver. "How's your shooting with your offhand?" Miguel stared at the arsenal Cal was assembling. "You cannot mean to fight them. There are at least 6 men in that group. We have no chance against such odds." Cal finished loading the shotgun. "Son, during the war I held a stone wall at Antietam with nothing but 5 other boys. We were outnumbered 15 to 1, and we held that ground for 3 hours. He looked directly at Miguel. "The thing about long odds is that they only matter if you're planning to fight fair, and I got no intention of fighting fair." The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer. There were 7 men, all armed and riding hard toward his farm. They wore a mixture of Mexican army uniforms and civilian clothes, but they moved with the coordination of soldiers. At their head rode a man whose bearing marked him as their leader. Cal positioned himself at the front window, while Miguel took up a position at the side window. The American cowboy felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same feeling he'd experienced before every battle during the war. "Remember," he said quietly, "don't shoot until I do, and when the shooting starts, don't stop until they're all down or running." The riders approached at a gallop, then spread out in a semicircle as they reached the yard. Their leader, a heavy-set man with a black beard, dismounted and walked toward the front door. He wore the uniform of a Mexican army sergeant, but the gold watch chain and expensive boots suggested he had been profiting well from his association with Colonel Varga. "Gringo!" the sergeant called out. "We know you have the traitor Herrera. Send him out now, and we will kill you quickly. Refuse, and we will make you watch while we burn your farm before we skin you alive." Cal's response was to cock his rifle. "Well now, that doesn't sound like much of a bargain from where I'm sitting. How about this instead? You boys mount up and ride on out of here, and I won't kill more than 3 or 4 of you for trespassing." The sergeant laughed harshly. "You are 1 man, Gringo, and we are 7. You have no chance." Funny thing about chances, they tend to change real quick when the shooting starts. The sergeant drew his revolver and fired a shot into the air. "This is your last chance, Gringo. Send out the traitor, or we come in and take him." Cal's rifle was already aimed when he made his decision. "Miguel, you ready to find out what kind of man you really are?" Before the captain could answer, Cal squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report boomed across the farmyard, and the sergeant spun around and fell to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The other riders immediately began shooting, their bullets splintering the wooden shutters. Miguel didn't hesitate. As the man by the barn raised his rifle, the young captain squeezed the trigger of his borrowed revolver. The shot went wide, but it was close enough to make the rifleman duck for cover. Cal was already working the lever of his rifle, chambering another round. The battle was brief but intense. Cal's years of combat experience showed in every movement. He shifted position constantly, never staying in one place long enough for the attackers to get a clear shot. His return fire was precise and deadly. Within minutes, 3 of the attackers were down, and the others were beginning to realize they had underestimated their opponent. Miguel proved to be a steadier shot than either he or Cal had expected. When one of the riders tried to rush the side window, the captain's 3rd shot caught him center mass. The young Mexican officer was pale and shaking, but he kept firing until his revolver was empty. The turning point came when Cal caught 2 of the attackers trying to set fire to the rear of the house. His shotgun spoke twice in quick succession, and both men went down. The surviving attackers, realizing their assault had turned into a slaughter, began to retreat toward their horses. "That's right," Cal shouted after them. "Run back to your colonel and tell him what happens to men who threaten peaceful folks." He fired one more shot over their heads, then watched as they disappeared in a cloud of dust. In the sudden silence, Cal became aware of Miguel standing in the doorway behind him, still clutching the empty revolver and staring at the bodies scattered around the farmyard. "Is this what war is like?" Miguel asked quietly. Cal looked at the carnage around his peaceful farm. "No. War is worse. Much worse." He began checking the fallen men, looking for any who might still be alive. As he knelt beside the wounded sergeant, Cal found something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in the man's shirt was a document bearing the seal of the Mexican army, but it wasn't signed by Colonel Varga. The signature belonged to General Joaquin Santos, the military commander of the entire northern region of Mexico. Cal stood up slowly, the document in his hand. Captain, I think your little corruption problem just got a whole lot bigger. Miguel examined the document and his face went pale. General Santos, if he is involved, then this conspiracy reaches to the highest levels of the Mexican army. Colonel Varga is not just a corrupt border commander, he is part of a plan that could destroy the peace between our nations. Before Cal could respond, they heard a sound like distant thunder growing steadily louder. A dust cloud was rising on the southern horizon that dwarfed anything they had seen before. Miguel grabbed Cal's spyglass and focused it on the approaching disturbance. Madre de Dios, the captain breathed. It is a full company of Mexican cavalry, perhaps more. They are flying General Santos's personal banner. He turned to Cal with desperation in his eyes. Senor, you must run. When they find their men dead here, they will assume you are part of some American plot. Cal took the spyglass and studied the approaching force. At least 120 mounted troops, riding in formation with military precision. These weren't border guards. They were Mexico's finest cavalry. How long do we have? Cal asked. Miguel checked the sun's position. Perhaps 20 minutes, no more. Please, you must go now, while there is still time. Instead of heading for his horse, Cal walked back into the farmhouse and began methodically loading every weapon he could find. Miguel, you still wearing my daddy's coat? The young captain looked down at the wool coat. See, but I do not understand. That coat has been in my family for 3 generations, Cal interrupted. My great-grandfather wore it when he stood with Sam Houston at San Jacinto. My grandfather had it on when he died defending the Alamo. My father carried it through the war until a Yankee bullet found him at Gettysburg. He looked up, and Miguel saw something in the American's eyes that commanded respect. Point is, that coat has never known defeat, and I ain't about to let it learn today. You keep it on, Captain, and we'll see this through together. Miguel stared at Cal. You cannot mean to fight an entire company of cavalry. It would be suicide. Cal's smile was grim but determined. Son, sometimes a man has to choose between dying on his feet or living on his knees. I made that choice a long time ago. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Through the window, Cal could see the dust cloud resolving into individual riders, their uniforms pristine and their weapons gleaming. At their head rode an officer, whose ornate uniform marked him as someone of considerable importance. That will be Colonel Ramirez, Miguel said quietly. He is General Santos's right hand, completely loyal and utterly ruthless. The cavalry formation halted just outside rifle range, and Colonel Ramirez rode forward alone, under a white flag. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a mustache waxed to perfect points. I am Colonel Francisco Ramirez of the Mexican Army, he called out in perfect English. You have in your possession a traitor to Mexico and documents stolen from official files. Surrender both immediately, and you will be treated according to the laws of war. Resist and you will be shown no mercy. Cal stepped out onto his front porch, his rifle held casually but ready. Name's Caleb Brennan, and this here's my farm. I got a guest who came to me wounded and asking for help, and I gave it to him according to the laws of hospitality. You want him? You'll have to go through me to get him. Colonel Ramirez studied Cal for a long moment. Senor Brennan, you are one man facing over 100 of Mexico's finest cavalry. Surely you cannot believe you have any chance of success. Colonel, during the war, I learned that numbers don't always tell the whole story. Sometimes it's not about how many men you have, but about how badly those men want to fight. The colonel's face darkened, but he maintained his composure. Very well, Senor Brennan. You have chosen your path. I regret that it leads only to death, but you have made your decision with full knowledge of the consequences. As Colonel Ramirez rode back to his formation, Cal returned to the farmhouse where Miguel was waiting. They will attack at sunset, the captain said. When the sun touches the horizon, they will come. Cal began preparing for a siege. He moved ammunition to positions where it could be easily reached, filled containers with water, and barricaded the windows and doors. Miguel, despite his wounded arm, worked alongside him with newfound determination. As they worked, Miguel began to speak about his life, his family, and the ideals that had led him to oppose Colonel Varga's corruption. Cal found himself talking about the war, about the friends he had lost, and about the loneliness that had driven him to this isolated farm. "You know," Miguel said as they finished their preparations, "when I put on this uniform, I thought I understood what it meant to serve with honor. But I never truly understood until today, watching you choose to fight impossible odds rather than abandon a stranger." Cal looked at the young captain, still wrapped in his father's coat. "Miguel, if we don't make it through this, I want you to know that helping you was the right thing to do. First time in years I felt like the man my father raised me to be." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the Mexican cavalry formed up for their attack. But as they prepared to charge, something unexpected happened. A new dust cloud appeared on the northern horizon, smaller than the Mexican force but moving with urgent purpose. Through his spyglass, Cal could make out the blue uniforms of American cavalry, and his heart leaped as he recognized the guidon of the 10th Cavalry Regiment, the Buffalo Soldiers from Fort Clark. At their head rode Major Samuel Washington, a former slave who had earned his commission through courage and competence. But what happened next defied all expectation. Instead of confronting the Mexican force, Major Washington rode directly toward Cal's farmhouse under a flag of truce. Behind him came not the expected military formation, but something unprecedented. Mixed in with the American cavalry were Mexican soldiers, regular Mexican army troops flying the colors of units loyal to the government in Mexico City. At their head rode a general Cal didn't recognize, a dignified older man whose presence commanded respect from both forces. As the combined force approached, Colonel Ramirez found himself caught between impossible choices: retreat or risk an international incident by attacking American forces on American soil. His hesitation gave Major Washington the opportunity he needed. "Cal Brennan," the major called out. "I've got some folks here who want to talk to you and your guest about those documents you're carrying." Cal stepped onto his porch, Miguel beside him still wearing the wool coat, and saw something that seemed impossible: Mexican and American officers standing together, united in common purpose. The general who had ridden with Major Washington stepped forward. "Senor Brennan, I am General Antonio Morelos of the Mexican Army. Captain Herrera, if you are indeed the man I believe you to be, you and this brave American have done both our countries a great service by preserving evidence of a conspiracy that threatened to destroy the peace we have worked so hard to build." As Miguel stepped forward and presented the documents, the full scope of what they had uncovered began to emerge. Colonel Varga and General Santos had not been working alone. They were part of a larger conspiracy involving corrupt officials on both sides of the border who profited from conflict. The evidence Miguel had gathered would not only expose their crimes, but prevent a war that would have cost thousands of lives. General Morelos examined the documents with growing amazement, then looked up at Cal. "Senor Brennan, you have risked your life to protect a man you barely knew, and in doing so you have helped preserve the peace between our nations. Mexico owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." General Morelos, acting on orders from the President of Mexico himself, declared that Cal's farm would be under the permanent protection of the Mexican Army as a gesture of gratitude for his sacrifice. 120 elite cavalry troops would be stationed in the area, ensuring that no harm would ever come to the American who had chosen honor over safety. Colonel Ramirez, faced with evidence of the conspiracy he had unknowingly served, surrendered his command and submitted to arrest. His troops, learning the truth about their mission, laid down their arms. As the sun set over the Rio Grande Valley, Cal stood on his porch and marveled at the transformation his simple act of kindness had wrought. Where there had been the threat of war, there was now the promise of lasting peace. Miguel, still wearing Cal's father's coat, stood beside his new friend. "Senor," he said quietly, "when I put on this coat last night, I was a man running from his past. Today, because of your example, I have found the courage to face whatever future awaits." Cal smiled and placed a hand on the young captain's shoulder. "Keep the coat, Miguel. Seems to me it's found the right man to carry on its tradition." He looked out at the scene before them, where Mexican and American soldiers shared coffee around their campfires, and felt a satisfaction deeper than any he had known since before the war. The lonely cowboy, who had given his final coat to a shivering stranger, had discovered that some sacrifices, made with pure intent, could change the world. And in the years that followed, the story of Cal Brennan's coat became legend, proof that one act of kindness, offered without thought of reward, could build bridges between hearts and heal wounds that had seemed impossible to mend.